Back to infrastructure as code or DevOps or whatever you want to call it. So that's a method that's actually really common in places like cloud deployments,
Mhm.
as you're constantly deploying from an image, and then you have to work that image into something that's usable for your application or however it's going to be utilized within your infrastructure. And I actually used to do this a lot like 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, I was a instructor for Red Hat training. And I would show up to teach a class every week, which meant that I had to install the boxes for class every week. And so every week I had a brand new system that was my system for the week.
Yep.
And so that's one where I learned how to be very comfortable with the defaults of the operating system. Because if you're rebuilding something every week, you don't want to get super fancy and spend an hour customizing it, because that's an hour that you're wasting every week. But then you also start thinking about what are the things that are really important to me. And so something like a tar archive, or I actually ended up checking a bunch of stuff into Git and just would do a Git pull down to my machine to set up the things I needed or track the files I wanted to track so that I could rebuild stuff when things went awry. And that
Right.
got me started into like never storing things locally. Always store stuff I care about over there. That way, if I drop my machine in the river, I'll get a replacement machine and pull down all my files to it, and I'm good to go.
Store the important stuff. Yeah. So this comes back to that: how quickly can you redeploy the stuff that's replaceable? The closer you get to automated system deployments and automated application deployments, the less data to worry about is that in the backup. Really, eventually you can get to a point where the only thing that matters is the data that needs to be persistent, that dynamic data that the application depends on. So just imagine you're deploying a database server. The database itself is probably the most important thing that you need to save, maybe some config options and whatnot. But if you get all of that baked into your deployment mechanisms, right? If you've got automated deployments that get the database laid down, get all the config in place that needs to be there, and the only thing you need to worry about is the data itself being in the backup, that makes recovery a whole lot easier. You just click a button, new database server pops out, you get the database pulled back in, and you're back up and running.
And the other thing we haven't talked about yet is actually testing things, right? So you always want
Yeah.
to test that your backup methods are sound. One, that you're actually capturing the data you think you're capturing in your backups, and that you're reliably doing it, right? So don't just be like, oh, that one time I checked it and it was fine. So now 4 years later, I've been running
Yes.
backups every week. I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah.
No.
I I've shared a story, I forget if it was on this show or not, but a number of times about the time that I accidentally cooked the rev manager for our virtualization infrastructure when I worked in higher ed. But I thought I had backups. And it turned out for months, my backups had stopped working because of something that changed in an upgrade. So, yes, I am living proof. Validate your backups. Make sure they work. Make sure they contain what you think they do, and do spot checks from time to time. A lot of places, especially that have more mature disaster recovery plans, do disaster recovery drills from time to time, where they're not just talking about it; they're actually doing it. They go to their remote site. Maybe if that's a virtual site, they do it virtually, and they try to restore some things, some of their core services, and see if they work like they're supposed to.
Yeah. And I see in chat you said Pixie installing beats image complexity, in my opinion. I agree that that company I was telling you about that had three different data centers in the same city.
Hmm.
Um, to do a restore of a machine would take like 10 hours
Hmm.
using the backup software that they had, and doing like full and complete system backups. It would take 10 hours to restore. Conversely, I could stand up a new replacement box with a Pixie Boot Kickstart in about 10 minutes. So if I can Pixie Boot
Right.
Kickstart 10 minutes and then not have to restore gigs and gigs of data, but instead only 1 gig or 300 meg, my recovery time goes from 10 hours to an hour and 15 minutes. Which would you prefer? I know I would prefer the less time.
Yes. Now, sometimes there's a little more legwork involved in the less time, but you get up so much faster, right? Like by legwork, I had to think about deploying a machine, making sure it had the right specs and whatnot for the thing I'm going to restore to it, and then restore the backup. Whereas if I'm just blindly restoring the backup, I'm blindly restoring the backup, right? If I'm doing a rear backup, like my example here, it's just, oh, make a new VM, attach the ISO, click the button, and wait. What if that took 10 hours?
Yeah,
Right.
that also assumes things like the hardware that you're attaching is the same hardware that you lost,
Right. Right.
right? Whereas if
Exactly.
you do a Kickstart install, it installs on the new hardware, whatever that is, and you're only pulling back the configs and whatever else that's really hardware independent. You can do, actually, Linux is really great about restoring things on changed hardware because the kernel will be like, whoa, this is weird, but okay, I have the driver for that. And some things like different MAC addresses for NICs and stuff like that will like mess stuff up. So you do have to be somewhat aware. And that's the other reason why I like a install replace.
The
Then
OS is clean then. Yeah.
and I can like, oh, that 20-year-old hardware that I lost in the flood, now I get brand new thanks to the insurance company
Right.
hardware, which is a little bit different, and I need to treat it a little bit differently.
And then sometimes that turns into that machine that was lost in the flood that was 10 years old had an OS that was 2 versions older on it. And now I need to figure out, am I putting something new on? Am I trying to replicate the old stuff? Am I going to regret that later? So there's a lot that goes into this.
That's part of your DR planning, and that's the
Yeah.
other, I think, piece that we didn't talk about. We talked a lot about the tools and like how you use the
Yeah, yeah.
tool, ways of using the tools, but you also have to have an overall plan. One of the most organized places I worked for disaster recovery, they had tiers. And tier 1 was like critical
Yeah.
applications that need to be restored first. And then tier 2 was like supporting applications that would be really nice to have, but don't make their way to tier 1. Tier 3 was like, yeah, I mean, I guess. And tier 4 was like, live without that. But I guess if we were putting everything back, we'd put those back too.
We'll replace that
Um,
someday. Yeah.
right. And they would do a DR plan and they'd periodically come to us and be like, hey, go through your entire system inventory and rate which tier all of these systems are in. And so we'd go through and update those parameters. The tiers also typically had SLAs. So, like tier 1 stuff had to be back within 1 day.
Hmm.
So, if there was a disaster, we would be expected to restore all of our tier 1 things within 1 business day or 1 24-hour period.
But when you're rating those tiers, you got to think about not just what's most important to the business, what's most important to the recovery effort, right? So if satellite, great example, we talked about this when we were planning the episode. Satellite might seem like it's tier 2 because having the system up is important, being able to update the system is important too, but maybe day 2 important, not day 1 important. However, if your recovery mechanisms depend on Kickstart and that's hosted by satellite, that's not just tier 1, that's tier 0. That has to be there before you can start tier 1, right? So just keep that in mind when you're planning this stuff.
Yeah. And so, and frequently reassess your population and decide whether you still, if you're the right settings or things have changed.
Right.
And then you come up with like, how am I actually going to restore this? What are the processes through which I actually rebuild and remake this thing in the timeline that I was assigned, right? That may make other choices like how you perform your backups, how you perform your restores. The timeline on which it has to be done may help make those choices. So when you make your plan, think about what you need to be back operational first, second, third, how long you expect it to take, or how long you're told it will take by someone else, another business owner or something. And then that can help inform some of your decisions and practices and what you're backing up and other stuff there too.
And I had at an information security conference years ago, I had talked to a company that they had made a card game for this is for information security breach incident response, but it's a similar concept, right? They made a game called Backdoors and Breaches. And if you've never heard of these people, then I'm not really going to give them a plug on the show. But the idea was the card game gives you an incident to respond to, and then it throws curveballs at you. There's cards in here, like here. This one is legal has taken away your most skilled handler to ask for a status update. So imagine your senior sysadmin was pulled into a meeting for 20 minutes and now they can't help you. Or see, there's another fun one here. Oh, Bobby the kills the system that you're reviewing. Right? I'd love it if their card game were like this for IT response too. If anyone knows about one, I'd love to hear it.